Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. Today's topic is one of our videos looking at World War I. Today's topic is looking at World War I on the American home front, kind of what was going on in the United States when America finally joined the war effort in April of 1917. For most of World War I, the United States stayed on the sidelines, stayed in that idea of neutrality, that this was not our fight, not worth fighting into. But once America commits to the war and declares war on Germany on April of 1917, we will see a mobilization on the home front among the civilians to help contribute to the overall war effort, and there'll be some impacts on the home front there as well. One of the large impacts this is going to have on American history on the home front is something called the Great Migration. The Great Migration was a mass migration of African Americans from the South to many northern cities to take advantage of job opportunities in many of the northern industrial factories. Throughout the lead up to World War I, and this will really kind of continue even up into the early 1920s, there's a great deal of labor shortage as many Americans were being drafted or volunteering to join the war effort. Many factories were short of workers. So African Americans in the South began to leave these southern states to go to these northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York to take advantage of these opportunities in the factories. Close to 500,000, half a million African Americans will make the migration to many of these northern cities to take advantage of these job opportunities, to hope to escape some of the racism and bigotry and segregation that had taken place after the Civil War in the South, after Reconstruction, that Jim Crow era where we see a great deal of segregation in Southern society. And because of the economic system of sharecropping, where African Americans were having to rent land to become farmers, which kind of put them into a state of poverty. There was just very little economic opportunities for many African Americans in the South. So as soon as northern factories began making advertisements that ran in many southern newspapers, hey, we're looking for factory workers, many African Americans will kind of pull up their family and load up the car and just head north and go to these larger cities. So we see a large influx of African Americans. However, when they get to these northern cities, it's not all positive. There's going to be a little bit of some racism and discrimination against African Americans moving to many of these northern cities as well. And a practice called redlining becomes pretty prominent in many northern cities. Redlining is a practice that established very clear areas where African Americans were allowed and not allowed to purchase or rent housing. So there was segregation, although it may not be necessarily through laws passed by northern states, but by just common practice by real estate agents or city council laws. They very quickly began to set up specific neighborhoods where African Americans were allowed to stay in and live in. They would not sell just in certain neighborhoods to African Americans moving into these northern cities, but they would sell them in more of the poorer regions of the cities. And so we have these redlining districts. In a lot of ways, we still see this in many of these northern cities today, including Omaha, Nebraska. This is a census from 2010 that shows ethnic breakdowns of many of the residents. The blue dots represents African Americans, the red dots represent Caucasian or white Americans, and the orange represents Hispanic. And you can see from the graph here, there's kind of a concentration or cluster of African Americans here in the northeast part of the city of Omaha. And that was established by this practice of redlining here in the 1920s as many African Americans move into the city to take advantage of opportunities in the meatpacking industry here in Omaha. They are kind of forced to segregate themselves into these specific areas that are predominantly African Americans. Other consequences on the home front during World War I is definitely limits on free speech. We like to believe under the First Amendment we have freedom of speech, that Congress can pass no law restricting our free speech, but sometimes during warfare there are tests put onto that free speech, and that definitely happens in World War I. In World War I we have the passage of something called the Sedition Act of 1918. The Sedition Act made it illegal for Americans to speak out or write or protest against the war. There was also a great deal of anti-German feelings because we're now at war with Germany. And so all these German immigrants who came to America and settled, especially in places here like Nebraska, where there's a large influx of German Americans living, there's a great deal of anti-German hatred towards them. There was a story of one here in Nebraska where a German American was kind of grabbed and roughed up and then tarred and feathered like they did back in the revolutionary time periods. So there's lots of this anti-German feelings. The photograph you see here to the left represents an anti-German war protest of Germans in Lincoln, Nebraska. Eugene Debs was a leader in the workers' movement around the turn of the century. He actually tries running for president as part of the U.S. Socialist Party, and he's very anti-war. He actually gets arrested for speaking out against the war and ends up serving several months in prison. And in 1920, while in prison, he actually runs for president under the U.S. Socialist Party. So there were restrictions put into place for freedom of speech. The other major piece that comes out on the home front during World War I is going to be this Selective Service Law. The Selective Service Law was passed in 1917 that required all men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register with their draft board so they could be drafted into military service. Close to 3 million Americans will be drafted in service into World War I. By the way, the Selective Service Law is still in effect today. The age now is 18, so if you are 18 years of age, you are required by law to register to your draft board. But we haven't had a draft since the Vietnam War in the 1970s. But this practice of drafting young men into combat, this selective service becomes kind of put into law in 1917. Another factor on the home front during World War I is the funding of the war. Wars can be very expensive. You're paying for the soldiers, you're paying for their weapons and supplies, and that's very expensive. And you can do that through collecting tax revenue by taxing the citizens, or you could also do what's called sell Liberty Bonds. Liberty Bonds are little certificates that you can purchase, and usually they're 15 or 30-year bonds. So as a citizen, you can buy those bonds, and then after a set time, then you can return those and get back some money plus an investment. Governments can sell these bonds so that they can raise money quickly up front to pay for things they need immediately, like weapons and paying for soldiers. So during the outbreak of World War I, the government begins selling these Liberty Bonds, and there are all kinds of posters, propaganda posters that come out during World War I to encourage Americans to do their part to financially support the war by buying these Liberty Bonds. So as America goes from being neutral, not wanting to be involved in the conflict, but once war breaks out and we declare war in 1917, there's a complete 180 in terms of Americans' views on World War I. We see changes on the American home front with the financial supporting of the war with Liberty Bonds. We see the Selective Service Act that requires Americans to register for the draft. And we also see restrictions put on free speech with the Sedition Act that says you cannot protest against the war. And we also see a mass migration of African Americans from the South to many northern cities like Omaha, Nebraska, New York, Chicago, Detroit, to take advantage of job opportunities in many of these northern cities. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.